there was another professional artist, Jane Mikasich, who's been selling work in Sacramento for 30 years now. And she was in my book group, and she was like, well, Maren, what are you making? And I was like, I'm helping kids kind of find their thing, but I'm not really making my own art right now. And, I have a son who's going to be 9 now. So, I was raising him and doing the mom thing, and I realized that, I just had gotten really far away from my own creative process other than like sketching and painting at home and not doing shows. And so she asked me to come give her like moral support in her studio, just to come paint with her. She's like, I don't even care what you paint, just come paint and be with me. And I was like, okay, that's great. And so she gave me a desk, a drafting desk in her studio, and I started painting. And then within like 3 months of starting to paint, she was like, well, I think you should do the show with me. And I was like, I don't know if I'm ready. She was like, oh, it'll be fine. And I said, okay. So I started playing with this whole layering process of layering actually pieces of plexi-glass, one on top of each other, to like add like a 3-dimensional component to paintings where they had depth and interest. And I was using a lot of like botanical based inspiration. So lots kind of flower, like delicate like Japanese maples and dogwoods and like different kind of like themes from nature and organic forms to make these 3-dimensional paintings on plexiglass. And I couldn't believe it, so we did the CCAS studio tour, me with her studio, and I made 9 paintings, and I think 7 sold. Wow. And it was just amazing, and I was like, oh my goodness, well obviously I'm like going in a good direction.
How long have you been working on this project?
6 weeks.
Well, you guys are awesome.
3 a.m. to 3 a.m. like every day. It's just insane.
Yeah, I bet.
Well, because they're pointless, so everything's made with just by repetitive dot making, and then I glazed color over the top. So they all started out as black and white portraits. And the color layers actually came on glass too. So everything started out
like this, and then so this is the first step. And then
was finding the images and then painting them onto the wood panels, and then starting the stippling process. I mean, these are all their stories too. These are all things that they published about themselves, which a lot of these women too, like in Piper Laurie's incident, it was in her autobiography, and she wrote about like this whole horrible experience of losing her virginity to Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I read your artist statement. I had no idea that happened.
You're right,
but that had been written about even.
Right, and that she was so forthcoming with it because like he like totally shamed her. Like what's wrong with you? You should have come 3 times, and I'm a superstar because I lasted 45 minutes. Like she was so forthcoming and wrote it all in her book.
She was like 14.
No, I think she was of age.
So how much time do you think you spent on like the research?
I spent 2 weeks on the research.
2 weeks on the research. Do you have a particular favorite? They all near and dear in their own special way.
They all have like really, really interesting backstories to them. Gigi Goya is Arnold's first mistress. Which is just, and then it uncovered this whole thing about his maid and the illegitimate child, and like this whole thing snowballed. But to like come out against like such a powerful man and married to such a powerful woman, and, like to have the courage to do that, I think is kind of the really interesting part of the story.
The concept is yours, right? The women and what gives it the color? Is that the resin, or is that this?
No, the resin's just clear. It's just clear. It's like a clear glue.
So you just put
that I pour, and then I paint between the layers. So if you get up close, you can see it in the scales. They're painted between layers. See how you can see this depth and dimension.
Okay. So this like sparkliness is like
the bottom layer.
The painting. Okay. I see.
It takes
like about that size.
About 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Especially because each layer of resin has a 12 to 24 hour dry time. So every layer you pour, you have to wait.
So to pump this out in 6 weeks is like pretty crazy.
It's insane.
Tell me how you kind of got in touch with Vanguard and how you took on this current project.
I've known Trevor probably 10 years now. He was one of the owners through mutual friends. And he had been following my artwork on Facebook because we're Facebook friends. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting what Maren's doing with her art. I'd love to talk to her. And to his marketing director, who's one of my close friends. So we're like, okay, so we set up a meeting. And I sat down with them, and then I had this huge painting that was 2 4-foot by 4-foot squares that was going behind the hotel check-in desk at the Hotel Andaz in Napa. So I had it in my car because it was getting delivered the next day. So like I schlepped in this giant painting, into Poorhouse, like laid it on the floor, and like we had this meeting, and he had a different concept for what he wanted for the artwork. That was something that wasn't something that I created, and it was also something that other artists have done. Instead of saying, I don't like this idea, and being offensive, I decided to approach it like a critique, which is finding something that, and start asking the right questions. So I said, well, what about that idea do you like? Why is this a direction you want to go in? What about this do you feel like is a good fit for your space? And we also looked over interior shots of the design plans, the interior design plans for the space. And so from that conversation, he was like, well, I really felt like it had a good edge on it, like it's an edgy idea, and it had an element of surprise to it. And he also liked the fact that it was taking like a vintage kind of antique concept. I said, you know, my great-grandfather was a state assemblyman, and we have this hilarious story in my family. My great-grandmother never touched a sip of alcohol in her entire life. She was like very proper. And she went to this party at the governor's mansion, and somebody had spiked the punch, and she got absolutely obliteratingly wasted. And this is, you know, 150 years ago. And ended up crawling into the governor's bed and passing out. And the governor...
Your grandmother did this?
My great-grandmother.
Your great-grandmother? Oh my gosh.
She was mortified, and she like moved back to San Dimas and never stepped foot in Sacramento ever again. And then my first job was at Cal Palmel lobbying firm, because my dad's a lobbyist. So I've like grown up with this like whole politics and women and booze, like a part of my family. So I'm like, this is a bar that's across from the Capitol. So I said, well, what if we did lovers and muses and mistresses? And we'd give it kind of a vintage antique feel. And I said, and with my paintings being high gloss resin, they're very modern. I said, so I think, you know, you would achieve that, what it sounds like you were desiring, which is something that's antique, yet new, something that has an edge because the concept is interesting. And I said, and something that leaves somebody asking more questions, or trying to figure out who these women are, or a little bit of scandal, a little, you know, on the walls. I uncovered like these really amazing, courageous women that were willing to be so publicly vulnerable about outing their own sexuality, about outing that a lot of them slept with married women, you know, and just in this interesting way that I think gave them depth and courage and character. And I really felt like honored that I was going to be able to paint them. Interested in Cleopatra lately because she overtly used her sexuality as a part of her power. And I feel like, you know, a lot of society always wants women to try to hide their sexuality when they're given a position of prominence or intellectual importance. We take that off the table for women so many times. So I painted all of these women naked, basically, or like in this area of nakedness where you can't really tell if they have clothes on or not because it's shoulder up. So they could be wearing a strapless dress, but they could be butt naked too, because they were all really comfortable with that part of themselves. And I think that that's a highly feminist message, that you can be a desirable woman and be powerful and be vulnerable and come out with your story, and that makes you more powerful. It makes you more significant. And they owned their stories, and the fact that so many of these men wanted to keep them hidden, I think it's really interesting. They were like, no, I will not sit down, I will not shut up, and I'm going to put this in the newspaper. Or I'm going to put this in my autobiography that's going to be published. You can't take this experience away from me and call it purely your experience and own it. Like, this was a shared experience that the two of us had, and they took their role to own it, which I think is amazing.